Thank you, Susan. Just a procedural note, we'll listen to the next presentation and then we'll open it up for questions after that so that we have both presentations. But as Dr. Purcell was talking, I couldn't help but think in terms of the cultural aspect and whether there are differences in how we approach conflict resolution between perhaps an emotional culture and a pragmatic culture. And perhaps today we may have a little bit of an understanding of that. At least we'll be able to perhaps appreciate if there are cultural differences between emotional and pragmatism that play a role in that. But next, I think I would like to hear from Dr. Gutierrez. Orlando?
Well, good morning. First of all, I want to apologize for being here slightly late. Dr. Purcell's presentation was excellent. I'm glad I listened to most of it. What I want to do is precisely pick up where Dr. Purcell left off, of where she mentioned, which is a perception of territorial disputes from within the emotional logic of the nation states. And that's what Guantanamo has to do with Cuban imagery and Cuban understanding of itself. And I think it strikes to the fact that there's, Dr. Arcel was mentioning, there's pragmatic reasons and there's emotional reasons. In the life of a nation state, both are very powerful. And both combine, and oftentimes it is the emotion which defines what is pragmatic or what is useful. As I sit here and I think about Guantanamo Naval Base, as I prepared for this conference, I went over some of the literature I could find of past Cuban governments. And it strikes me that as I sit here and I watch and I look at the different presidents of Cuba, every single Cuban head of state, with the exception of Estrada Palma, who had too many things on his plate, every single Cuban president, and I found it remarkably interesting, every single Cuban president has insisted on addressing the issue of Guantanamo and on having Guantanamo Naval Base returned to, or given to, or recognized to Cuban sovereignty. I have Dr. Pedro Roy here, who's a renowned Cuban historian. Feel free to correct me at any time. Every Cuban state has demanded a resolution of the Guantanamo dispute. And Fidel Castro has picked up on this long-standing demand of those who lead the Cuban nation state for the recognition of Cuban sovereignty over Guantanamo. It is particularly interesting to me that in spite of all the propaganda and all the ideological confrontations of the Cold War, the governments of Batista from 40 to 44, of Grau, of Prio, and then Batista again, even after the coup in 1952, insisted on addressing the issue of Guantanamo. So it's remarkable how the Cuban Republic saw Guantanamo as a vital part of the definition of its national identity. And Fidel Castro picked up on this demand when he began to insist on the devolution of Guantanamo. I think he picked up on it because it was a long-standing claim of Cuban nationalism. And I think this has a lot to do with, and there may be points here which are similar to what is going on with the dispute over the islands between Japan, the Republic of China, and Taiwan, and the Popular Republic of China, because the Cuban Republic, which was finally established in 1902, at first didn't have sovereignty over Guantanamo or the Isle of Pines. Later on, the Isle of Pines was recognized under Cuban sovereignty. But what is striking is that no independent Cuban government, be it a republic, be it a dictatorship, or the totalitarian regime of the Castro brothers, has ever had complete sovereignty over all of Cuban territory. There's always been a part of Cuban territory outside of the control of Cuba's national government. And if we go back to Charles Tilley's famous definition of what constitutes a nation state, where he said, unified government, unified territory, standing army, ability to tax the entire population, defense of cities and countryside, then we see that in the way Cubans perceive themselves, part of Cuba's incompleteness as a nation state has been the fact that all Cuban territory has not been under one national government. And I'm trying to analyze this from a point of view of the logic of the Cuban nation state beyond the differences we have with the regime today in Cuba. I'm seeing it as I look at those presidents and I think of what is there now, of the logic of the Cuban nation state and how it perceives itself. It is also of even greater interest to me that for a book I've been working on, when I review the literature of the exile movements, of the anti-Castro movements inside and outside Cuba to overthrow the Castro regime and to restore democracy in Cuba, in every single one of the statements of those movements, even the ones who were heavily backed up by the United States against Castro, there's always a demand to resolve the Guantanamo issue in recognition of Cuban sovereignty. Why am I saying this? Because it's remarkable to me that after a half century of existence of Cuba, of a communist dictatorship, and of a thriving exile community, I have yet to find in the literature any Cuban of leadership who holds a representation of Cubans saying Guantanamo should remain in foreign hands. It's a long-standing issue of Cuban sovereignty. It is also remarkable to me that how Cubans see Guantanamo, beyond the logic of the nation state, how Cubans see Guantanamo has also evolved over time. From a leftover of the very strange way through which Cubans achieved independence, the very convoluted way in which Cuban independence was achieved, Guantanamo evolved under the Castro brothers to a symbol of freedom. It was the way how thousands of Cubans have found freedom. Guantanamo became ringed with mines, both from the American side and the Castro regime, to try and prevent people from leaving. And those mines are still claiming lives in Cuba to this day. It's amazing how it's still going on. And the Americans mined Guantanamo in the Cold War idea of a possible Cuban invasion, or Castro-led invasion of Guantanamo. From a focal point of the Cold War confrontation over Cuba, Guantanamo became a central piece, or a very important part of the war against terror, a very controversial part. And Cuba became a footnote to Guantanamo within that scheme of things. I believe that Guantanamo is a very complex nationalistic issue for Cuba. It is today suppressed by more immediate issues, such as the issues of human rights violations in Cuba, of the controversy over the embargo, but it is there, and it should not be dismissed. And it will reappear at any moment. And it's interesting enough also that one of the lesser known parts of the very controversial Helms-Burton bill, which has been so debated, one of the most interesting parts to me of the Helms-Burton bill is the Helms-Burton bill calls for the return of Guantanamo to Cuban sovereignty once a freely elected government is established. That was included as part of American law. So I think that the importance of Guantanamo, to me, is that it can serve as a powerful symbolic weapon. Instead of weapon, a powerful symbolic tool for any American administration to promote democracy within Cuba. And I'll explain what I mean by this. Certainly, one of the pillars of the psychological control of the Castro regime of the Cuban people has been Castro's manipulation of Cuban nationalism. He took certain key topics that were present in the political discourse of the Republic, and he turned them into instruments of consolidation of his regime. Guantanamo was one of those. He also used this very pragmatically, because right after September 11, 2001, when the Castro regime feared some kind of backlash from the Americans, Raul Castro quickly said, no, they can do with Guantanamo whatever they want, and if they take terrorists there, we'll make sure they don't get out. So they were willing to use Guantanamo in a utilitarian manner. But I think a very powerful tool would be that the United States government addresses one of those issues of Cuban nationalism, which I think certainly is present in the Cuban armed forces, and reminds the future of Cuba and the possible predominant actors within the institution of the armed forces that U.S. law calls for the return of Guantanamo to a freely constituted Cuban government, to a freely elected Cuban government. This, of course, runs into internal issues in the U.S. Within America's new perception of its international security, and within the logic of the war against terror, Guantanamo has come to play a pretty important role. And when I have discussed this issue with people in the United States government, they say, well, one of the main obstacles to this kind of public proclamation of Guantanamo's future lies within the American armed forces and the role they see for Guantanamo, even in the future. I think the issue of achieving a stable democratic government in Cuba is far greater than what are temporary security mandates for Guantanamo. I think that the need to address nationalism as one of the binding knots of the Castro regime would give us a far more realistic policy towards Cuba. And also the fact that the desire for democracy in Cuba, the desire for free elections, the desire for respect for human rights is very much tied into Cuban national identity. I believe that at a strategic point in time, it would be very important for any American administration to stand up and clearly say, Guantanamo, we have no long-term interest in Guantanamo. U.S. law mandates the return of Guantanamo to a freely constituting Cuban government. And when there is a freely elected Cuban government, Guantanamo will be returned. That will mean that some future Cuban government, elected by the Cuban people, will be the first government of Cubans in Cuban history to control all of Cuba's national territory. This is a powerful nationalistic incentive for change inside Cuba, and eliminates some of the noise which the present regime has created in order to prolong its life in power. I don't believe that we can dismiss the Guantanamo issue. I believe it's a dormant but powerful issue in U.S.-Cuba relations. I think it must be addressed in as much as we understand which have been the main principles, the main guiding forces of the Cuban nation state as such. And I believe it would help to partner the United States and Cuba in the construction of a future democratic republic. So, thank you.